The small town was alive with noise that afternoon. The sun beat down on the dusty street, and the air carried the smell of sweat, horses, and hot earth. People gathered in the center of the marketplace, voices rising, laughter rolling through the crowd like a wave. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary day in town, but then one could see what held everyone's attention. Near a wooden post, in the middle of the open space, a young woman stood chained like a prisoner. The heavy iron links wrapped around her wrists and ankles, fastening her to the rough timber. She looked fragile but fierce, her clothes torn and dust-stained, her face streaked with dirt. The townsfolk stood back, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads in pity. Others smirked as if enjoying the shameful sight. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, too young to understand why the woman was tied there, but old enough to feel the strangeness of it. A group of men leaned against a wagon, laughing as though the whole thing were nothing more than entertainment. The girl did not speak. Her lips were dry, her eyes sunken, but there was something in her gaze that refused to break, even while others laughed or whispered. She stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted just enough to show she still had spirit left. That look unsettled some who saw it, for it was not the look of someone defeated. Rumors floated through the crowd like smoke. Some said she had been abandoned, left without family or friends, taken in by people who did not want her. Others whispered that she had been betrayed by her own kin. A few claimed she was nothing but trouble, a wanderer who had brought shame upon herself. Nobody knew the truth, but all were ready to speak as if they did. The heat of the day pressed on her skin, and the dust clung to her hair, but she did not beg for mercy. She did not cry out. Each time someone stepped closer to jeer at her, she simply looked at them with eyes that carried both sadness and quiet strength. That stare made them step back again, as if ashamed. Still, no one lifted a hand to help her. Hours passed, and the girl's strength began to fade. She swayed against the post, her chains clinking softly, the sound almost lost in the laughter around her. She thought of freedom as something far away, something she might never see again. Yet in her heart, she kept a small ember of hope alive. She whispered a silent promise to herself that she would not let them crush her spirit, no matter how they treated her. As the sun dipped lower, the noise in the marketplace grew louder. The men who had dragged her there began to speak about what to do with her. They treated her as if she were an object, something to be bargained over. People leaned closer, their curiosity bright in their eyes. The girl's thoughts drifted. She remembered softer days from long ago, before her life had turned into hardship. She thought of the sound of wind through tall grass, the laughter of children, the comfort of a home she once had. Those memories were like water in a desert, keeping her alive even as she stood in chains. A boy no older than 12 crept closer to her with wide eyes. He carried a small piece of bread in his hand. Quietly, while the adults were distracted, he placed it near her foot and whispered, "Don't give up." Then he ran back into the crowd before anyone could notice. The girl's lips trembled with the ghost of a smile. That simple act of kindness reminded her she was not completely forgotten. The crowd roared again when one of the men lifted a sack and shook it, declaring there would be bidding. It was a cruel scene, and yet no one stopped it. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her heart. She had no control over what was happening. She felt small, powerless, and yet she refused to break down. Some women in the crowd muttered disapproval under their breath, but none of them dared speak aloud. They had families to protect, reputations to keep. So they looked away, ashamed, pretending they saw nothing. The girl's chains glistened in the sunlight. She shifted her weight, the metal biting into her skin, and wondered if this would be her life forever. A caged bird, never free. Her heart longed for escape, but her body was too weak to fight. From somewhere behind the crowd, a horse snorted. The girl turned her head slightly and caught sight of a figure standing apart from everyone else. A tall man in a wide hat leaned against a fence, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. He did not gossip or jeer. He simply watched in silence, as though weighing something deep inside himself. The girl wondered who he was. He looked like a rancher, with dust on his boots and sun-worn skin. He carried himself with calm strength, as if he belonged to the open land beyond the town. She could not read his face under the brim of his hat, but she sensed something different in him. The men who held her shouted again, calling for bids, waving their arms to stir excitement. A few coins clinked in hands, laughter rolled again, but the girl felt none of it mattered. The crowd would not save her. Hope was a thin thread slipping from her grasp, and yet her eyes kept drifting back to the quiet figure in the shadows. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He simply stood, a silent presence, calm and steady while the rest of the world treated her like a spectacle. For the first time that day, she felt the stir of curiosity inside her despair. The wind picked up dust, swirling it around the street. The chains rattled softly as the girl shifted, squinting against the light. Somewhere in her chest, that small ember of hope glowed a little brighter. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps it meant nothing. But she clung to it anyway. No one noticed. The way the rancher's hand dropped to the pouch on his belt, the quiet weight of coins resting there. No one saw the way his gaze never left the girl, watching with silent patience. The marketplace was loud, the people cruel, but in that one moment, she felt the possibility that her life was not finished yet. Somewhere in the distance, something was about to change. The marketplace buzzed with restless voices as the men shouted over one another, calling for bids. They treated the scene as if it were a game, laughing at their own cruel jokes. Coins clinked in the hands of those who had come prepared, but most only gathered to watch the spectacle. The girl kept her eyes on the ground, her wrists aching from the weight of the chains, her body tired from standing for so long. She told herself not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Still inside her heart, fear battled against her thin thread of hope. In the distance, leaning against the fence at the far edge of the crowd, stood the quiet rancher. He had arrived without a word, unnoticed at first. His broad shoulders were set beneath a worn leather jacket, his wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes. Dust clung to his boots and his hands were rough from years of work under the sun. The people in town knew him but rarely spoke with him. He lived far out on his ranch, keeping to himself, spending his days with his cattle and horses. He was known for being a man of silence, one who never raised his voice, never wasted words. As the shouts carried on, his gaze did not waver from the girl. He watched her the way a rancher might watch a wild horse, wounded, cornered, but still holding spirit in its eyes. His jaw tightened slightly, though no one could see it beneath the shadow of his hat. He did not laugh like the others. He did not whisper cruel things or shake his head in pity. He only stood there, as though the whole world had narrowed down to the sight of the girl chained to that post. The bidding began with small amounts. A man tossed a single coin into the air, grinning as if daring others to match him. Another doubled the bid, laughing as though he had won a prize. The crowd hooted and hollered, each trying to outdo the last, not because they truly wanted the girl, but because they enjoyed the act of pretending. She listened to the numbers rise and fall like arrows flying past her ears. Each bid felt like a mark against her dignity, as though her worth could be measured in coins. She lifted her head once, searching the faces, and again her eyes landed on the rancher. He had not moved. His arms were still crossed, his body still leaning against the fence. But his presence pressed against her heart like something solid, something she could not understand. He was not part of their game, she realized. He was waiting. For what, she did not know. The men running the show called for higher bids, their voices growing louder, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of making a profit. They mocked those who offered too little, praising those who tossed in more. But soon the crowd began to lose interest. The numbers stopped climbing. The laughter grew dull. No one truly wanted to take responsibility for her. They had entertained themselves enough, and now many were ready to drift away. Then the quiet rancher finally moved. He straightened slowly, pushing himself away from the fence. His boots crunched against the dirt as he stepped forward. The sound of his steps, heavy and calm, cut through the restless chatter. The crowd shifted, turning their heads to watch. Some whispered his name under their breath. Others frowned, curious about what he was doing. He had never been one to involve himself in town business, never one to speak up or make a scene. The girl's heart beat faster. She kept her eyes fixed on him as he drew closer, his figure solid against the fading light of the afternoon. He walked without hurry, Without hesitation, each step steady as though he had already made up his mind. When he reached the center, he stopped in front of the men who held the bidding. He did not shout.
He did not bargain.
Instead, he reached into the pouch at his side and pulled out a handful of coins. The clinking sound was heavier than any bid before it. He let the pouch drop onto the wooden table with a dull thud that silenced the crowd. The men blinked, their mouths hanging open. It was more money than anyone had expected, far beyond the little bids tossed around before. One of them stammered, asking if he was certain, but the rancher said nothing. He only looked at the girl, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His silence was answer enough. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some scoffed, muttering that he was a fool for wasting good money. Others whispered that perhaps he saw something they did not. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, asking questions that had no easy answers. The laughter was gone now, replaced by curiosity and a quiet kind of respect. The men hesitated, but the pouch on the table gleamed with weight. Greed won over doubt. They nodded quickly, agreeing to his unspoken terms. With a wave of their hands, they signaled that the girl now belonged to him. The chains could be his to remove. The girl stood frozen, her heart racing. She had dreamed of freedom, but now she wondered what this meant. Why had he done this? What would he want in return? Fear clashed with hope, confusion swirling in her chest. She had been treated as less than human for so long that she could not imagine someone choosing to help her for no reason. The rancher stepped closer, his movements steady, unhurried. From his belt, he pulled a small tool and bent down to the chains. The crowd leaned forward, watching in silence. The sound of metal snapping filled the air as he cut through the iron. One by one, the bindings fell away. The girl winced as the last chain dropped, the weight leaving her wrists raw but free. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was no longer bound. She stumbled slightly, her knees weak, but the rancher reached out a hand to steady her. His touch was firm but gentle. Not a grip of ownership, but of support. She looked up at him, searching his face, but his eyes were hidden in shadow. He gave no smile, no words, only a nod as if telling her it was time to leave. Without another glance at the crowd, he guided her toward his wagon. The people parted silently, watching them pass. Some shook their heads, others whispered, but none dared to stop him. The rancher's quiet authority carried weight that no one wanted to challenge. The girl climbed into the wagon, her body trembling, her mind swirling with questions. He followed, taking the reins without a word. The horse snorted, the wheels creaked, and slowly the wagon rolled away from the marketplace. The crowd lingered in silence, staring after them until the dust swallowed their figures. The girl sat in the back, clutching the rough blanket he had placed beside her. She watched his profile as he guided the horse down the long road out of town. He did not speak, did not even glance back at the people they had left behind. His silence was heavy, but it did not feel cruel. It felt like the calm before something new, something she could not yet name. Her heart pounded in her chest, torn between fear and hope. She was no longer chained, no longer mocked, no longer abandoned in the middle of a jeering crowd. Yet she did not know what awaited her on the rancher's land. Still, as the town faded into the distance, she felt a small breath of relief. Whatever came next, it could not be worse than what she had already endured. And though the wagon rattled quietly on the dirt road, her thoughts echoed loud within her. Who was this man who bought her freedom in silence, and why? The wagon rattled softly as it rolled down the long dirt road. The sound of the wooden wheels turning against the ground mixed with the steady clop of the horse's hooves. The marketplace was far behind them now, only a faint memory swallowed by dust. The girl sat in the back, holding the rough blanket the rancher had given her. She wrapped it around her shoulders, not only for warmth but also for comfort, as if the fabric might shield her from the questions crowding her mind. The rancher sat at the front, reins in hand, his posture steady, his face calm beneath the brim of his wide hat. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken a single word since he cut her chains. To her, his silence was both strange and comforting. Strange because she had grown used to words being thrown at her like stones. Mockery, cruelty, commands. Comforting because his quiet seemed different, not cruel or cold, but heavy with thought. The road stretched on, lined with tall grass that swayed in the evening wind. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. The girl's eyes lingered on the open land. She had not seen such wide, empty beauty in a long time. For months she had been surrounded by walls, by people who treated her as less than human. Now, though she was still unsure of her fate, the open sky made her chest feel lighter. Her wrists still ached where the chains had rubbed her raw, and each time the wagon jolted, her body reminded her of how weak she had become, but she kept her back straight. She didn't want him to think she was fragile, even though she felt like she could collapse any moment. After a while, her curiosity grew stronger than her fear. She leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling as she spoke for the first time since he freed her. Why did you do it?" she asked softly. The rancher did not turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on the road, his hands steady on the reins. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer at all. Then, just when she was about to shrink back into silence, he said in a low, calm voice, "No one should live in chains." That was all. 6 words. But they sank deep into her heart. She had expected a reason, a condition, maybe even a demand. Instead, he gave her a truth so simple that it shook her. She sat back, holding the blanket tighter, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. The rest of the ride passed in quiet. Occasionally, the rancher would glance back to make sure she was all right, but he said nothing more. She found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. He moved with the ease of a man who had lived his whole life on the land. His shoulders were strong from hard work, his hands rough but steady. His silence was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of someone who carried his thoughts deep inside. As the sky darkened, the wagon finally turned off the main road. A wooden fence came into view, stretching far across the land. Beyond it, rolling fields spread wide, dotted with cattle grazing peacefully. In the distance, she saw horses, their manes catching the fading light as they ran along the pasture. Her breath caught. The sight was so free, so alive, that it almost hurt her to look at it. The rancher guided the wagon through a gate and onto a long path leading toward a cluster of buildings. There was a large barn, its roof red against the pale sky, and a modest farmhouse with smoke rising gently from the chimney. A smaller cabin stood nearby, simple but neat, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. The whole place was quiet, save for the soft lowing of cattle and the rustle of the evening wind. The wagon came to a stop near the barn. The rancher climbed down, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He tied the horse's reins to a post, then turned to help her. She hesitated, unsure if she could move without stumbling, but when he offered his hand, she accepted it. His grip was firm, steady, guiding her down carefully as though she were something fragile he refused to let fall. She expected him to lead her into the farmhouse, but instead, he walked toward the small cabin and opened the door. Inside, the space was simple but warm. A narrow bed stood against one wall, neatly made with a thick quilt. A wooden table and chair sat near the window, and in the corner a small stove waited to be lit. Everything was clean, cared for, yet humble. He set down a lantern, lighting the room with a soft glow. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes wide. She had prepared herself for the worst, for being locked away, treated no better than before, but instead he showed her this, a place of her own. The rancher turned to her, his voice steady but quiet. "This is yours," he said. The words struck her harder than any chain. Hers? She blinked, not sure if she had heard right. She looked around again at the bed, the table, the little stove. It was small, yes, but to someone who had been treated as nothing, it felt like a palace. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to tell him she didn't understand. But he had already turned, leaving the cabin to give her space. She stood there, holding the blanket tighter, and for the first time in so long she felt safe. That night she lay on the bed staring at the wooden ceiling. The quilt was soft against her skin, warmer than anything she had felt in months. Sleep came slowly, her mind restless with questions, but eventually her exhaustion won. Before her eyes closed, she whispered a single word into the dark. "Thank you." The next morning, the smell of fresh hay and the sound of roosters woke her. She rose carefully, her body still sore, and stepped outside. The rancher was already at work, carrying a heavy bale of hay across the yard. His movements were strong, practiced, as if he had done this every day of his life. He didn't notice her watching, or if he did, he gave no sign. She stood there, breathing in the crisp morning air. For the first time in so long, she wasn't afraid of what the day would bring. She didn't know what her future held, but she knew one thing. She was no longer chained. She was free, and the quiet rancher had given her that freedom without asking for anything in return. Her journey was not over. She still had much to heal, much to learn, but as she watched him work under the rising sun, she felt something stir deep inside her, something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The days passed slowly, each one carrying with it a sense of newness the girl had almost forgotten could exist. At first, she moved through the ranch in silence, unsure of where she fit. She woke each morning to the smell of hay, the soft calls of cattle, and the sound of the rancher's boots crunching against the dirt as he began his chores at dawn. He worked with steady rhythm, lifting, carrying, mending, moving from one task to another without complaint and without hurry. His life seemed simple, but it was clear to her it was also built on discipline and patience. The girl stayed near the cabin at first, nervous about stepping beyond the space he had given her. She thought perhaps it was only temporary, that one day he would take back his kindness, but he never did. Each time he passed her cabin, he tipped his hat gently in greeting or nodded toward the yard if he wanted her to join him. He never demanded. He never shouted. He left the choice to her. It took time before she gathered the courage to step outside and follow him into the rhythm of his work. The first time she offered to carry a small bucket of water from the well. Her hands trembled, her arms weak, but she carried it carefully, spilling only a little along the way. He said nothing, only gave her a small nod of approval. That simple gesture filled her with more pride than she could have imagined. In the days that followed, she began helping with little things, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, brushing the horses. The tasks were simple, but to her they felt like steps toward freedom. Each one reminded her that she was no longer chained, no longer mocked. She was trusted to work beside him, to share in the care of the land. The rancher's silence was something she had once feared, but now she came to understand it differently. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he respected words. When he spoke, his words carried weight, steady as the earth he worked on. Sometimes, when the sun was low and the day's work was done, he would speak a sentence or two about the land, about the cattle, about the way the seasons changed. Those words became treasures to her, bits of truth she held close to her heart. One afternoon she stood beside him as he repaired a broken fence. The sun beat down and sweat rolled down his brow, but he worked calmly, his hands steady on the hammer. She held the wooden posts in place, her arms aching, but she refused to let go until he nodded. For the first time, she felt the satisfaction of hard work done with purpose. That evening she returned to her cabin, her muscles sore but her spirit alive. She looked in the small mirror that hung on the wall and hardly recognized herself. Her eyes no longer seemed hollow. Her face held color again, her shoulders straighter. It was as though the land itself was healing her, giving her strength with each passing day. The townsfolk began to whisper again when they saw her. On the rare occasions she accompanied the rancher into town for supplies, people stared. They could not believe the change in her. The girl, once chained like an animal, now walked beside the quiet rancher with her head held high. Some whispered cruelly that she would only bring him trouble. Others, quieter, admitted they had misjudged her. Whatever their thoughts, she did not let their words weigh her down anymore. She had learned that her worth was not measured by their gossip. She found joy in small things again. She began humming softly while she worked, simple tunes she remembered from childhood. Sometimes, while tending the horses, she laughed aloud when one nuzzled her shoulder or tugged playfully at her sleeve. The sound of her own laughter startled her at first, but soon it came more easily, more freely. The rancher noticed these changes but never spoke of them. Instead, he allowed her the space to grow, to heal in her own time. He did not ask about her past. He did not question her scars or her silence. He seemed to know that some things healed best without being forced into words. One evening, after a long day of work, the girl sat on the porch of her cabin watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and crimson, the fields glowing in the fading light. The rancher walked by carrying a bucket and paused for a moment beside her. "You did good today," he said simply. Her heart swelled at the words. It was the first time he had spoken praise so directly, and it meant more to her than 1,000 empty compliments from others. She smiled softly, nodding, too overwhelmed to speak. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far she had come in such a short time. Just weeks before, she had been chained, mocked, and treated as nothing. Now she was free, trusted, and slowly finding herself again. She realized that freedom was not just about removing chains from her wrists. It was about learning to live without fear, to trust herself again. The seasons began to shift. Summer's heat softened into autumn's cool air. The fields turned golden, the trees shedding their leaves. Each change of the land brought new work, and with it, new lessons. The girl learned to stack hay, to milk the cow, to ride a horse with steady balance. She stumbled often, made mistakes, but each time she tried again until she got it right. Through it all, the rancher remained by her side, not hovering, not controlling, but steady, like a quiet guard watching over her without words. She began to see him not just as the man who had freed her, but as the reason she was learning to live again. His silence no longer frightened her. It gave her peace. One morning she woke before dawn and stepped outside. The air was crisp and the stars still dotted the sky. She saw the rancher already at work, moving in the shadows, feeding the animals. For a moment she simply watched him, realizing how much of his life he had given to this land and how much of his kindness he had quietly given to her. She whispered softly to herself, "I will not waste this chance." Her days were no longer filled with fear or shame. They were filled with purpose. And though she knew the road ahead was long, she also knew she was walking it with strength she had thought was lost forever. The girl who had once been chained was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone freer, stronger, and braver. She had begun to find her dignity again, and though the rancher never asked for thanks, she knew she owed him more than words could ever say. The autumn air grew colder as days shortened and nights stretched longer across the ranch. The girl, once frightened and broken, now rose each morning with quiet strength. Her hands bore the marks of work, her clothes carried the scent of earth and hay, and her voice, once silent, now filled the air with soft humming as she moved through her chores. She had found a rhythm in the simple life, and though it was not easy, it gave her a sense of belonging she had never known before. But deep inside her, questions remained. She had been given freedom, shelter, and trust, yet she still could not understand why the rancher had chosen to save her. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, she decided to ask. The rancher was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, sharpening a tool. His movements were slow, steady, like everything else he did. The girl approached, her steps hesitant but determined. She stood quietly for a moment, gathering her courage before speaking in a soft voice. "Why did you help me?" she asked. The rancher looked up, his calm eyes meeting hers. For a long moment he didn't answer. He seemed to weigh the words carefully, as if choosing which ones mattered most. Finally he said simply, "No one deserves chains." The girl swallowed, her throat tight. She had heard those words before from him, but now in the quiet of the ranch they carried even more weight. He had not saved her for reward or pity or pride. He had done it because he believed it was right. That truth filled her with warmth she could hardly describe. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "You gave me more than freedom. You gave me back myself." The rancher gave a small nod, not asking for thanks. He returned to his work and she stood there in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sorrow but from gratitude. From that day, their bond deepened, not through long conversations but through quiet understanding. They worked side by side, mending fences, tending to cattle, riding out into the fields. Sometimes he taught her new skills, showing her how to handle a horse with gentle hands, how to use tools with steady care. Other times they worked without words, sharing the kind of silence that felt full instead of empty. The girl grew stronger each day. Her laughter, once rare, came more often now. She discovered joy in small moments, watching a foal take its first steps, feeling the wind on her face as she rode across the open fields, hearing the rancher's steady voice when he gave a word of praise. Each of these moments stitched her heart back together piece by piece. The townsfolk noticed the change. When she walked into town beside the rancher, carrying herself tall and proud, people no longer mocked. Some looked away in shame, remembering how they had once laughed at her suffering. Others whispered in awe, wondering how the quiet rancher had transformed the broken girl into someone radiant with dignity. But the girl did not care for their whispers anymore. She had learned where her worth lay, and it was not in their shallow words. It was in her work, her courage, and the quiet bond she shared with the man who had seen her as human when no one else did. One winter evening, as snowflakes drifted softly across the fields, the girl sat inside her cabin by the small stove. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the room. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the chains, the crowd, the silence of the rancher, and the freedom she now lived in. Her heart swelled with gratitude so deep it almost hurt. She stepped outside, the cold biting at her cheeks. The rancher was nearby, feeding the horses, his breath forming white clouds in the air. She walked toward him, her steps crunching on the snow. When he looked up, she met his eyes and said, her voice clear and steady, "You saved me, but you also taught me how to save myself." For the first time since she had known him, the rancher's lips curved into a faint smile. It was small, quiet, but it warmed her more than the fire in her cabin. From that moment, she knew their bond was unshakable. It was not built on debts or obligations, but on respect and trust. They did not need many words to understand one another. Their lives spoke for them. As the seasons turned again, the girl became a true part of the ranch. She no longer felt like a guest or someone taken in out of pity. She felt like she belonged to the land, to the work, and to the quiet companionship of the rancher. Together they built a life not of luxury or wealth, but of dignity and freedom. The story of the girl who had once been chained spread quietly through the town and beyond. Some called it a tale of kindness, others a story of justice. But for her it was simply the truth of a second chance. She had been broken and forgotten, yet through one man's silent courage, she had been restored. Years later, when she looked back, she would remember that first night in the cabin, the way the quilt felt against her skin, and the first breath she took without chains. She would remember the rancher's steady hands freeing her, and his calm voice reminding her of a truth too easily forgotten. No one deserves chains. She carried those words with her always, like a lantern against the darkness. And as she walked the open fields side by side with the quiet rancher, she knew she had not only found freedom, she had found home.